Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. My website is donkpreston.com or BibleProphecy.com or eschatology.org. I invite you to check those out. And also, here we are. This is the last day of January 2025. Has this month flown by? Anyway, today's the last day to take advantage of my fantastic two-book offer for January 2025, U.S. orders only. The very first book is One Root, One Kingdom, All Nations. This book has been called a definitive refutation of the accusation that preterism is, quote, replacement theology. That's a pejorative term that is so very, very often used. But this book has also been called an utter refutation of what is known as the Israel only view. That is the idea that the biblical narrative is exclusively focused on Israel. God doesn't love you and me as Gentiles. He has no plan for you and me as Gentiles. Heaven is not for us in any way. It's an abhorrent doctrine. Lamentably, it's gaining a few advocates and followers. But this book, One Root, One Nation, or One Kingdom, All Nations, is a good refutation of that. And including in it is my book, Into All the World, Then Comes the End. Now, what happened was I didn't anticipate the response. We sold out of my inventory almost immediately. And I'm supposed to have some new inventory in at the time of the filming of this. Okay. But I hope you placed your order anyway, because I made the offer earlier in the month. Go ahead and make the purchase. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, and order the books. They will be on back order. Okay? Hopefully, my inventory has come in by the time I'm filming this. I'm filming this before the 31st. As I film this, my inventory has not arrived. So, anyway, my offer was if you place your order and the inventory has not come in, when our inventory does come in, we will fulfill the order, but I will also give you, totally free of charge, a copy of my book, Can God Tell Time? Now, go ahead and place your order. And like I said, today, the 31st of January, 2025, is the last day for this offer, so you need to take advantage of it. Okay, all of that said. Now, last week, I continued our study, and of course, obviously, we are continuing our overall study of the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is, and was and is, that Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. Do not believe me for my word's sake, believe me for my works, so that you may know that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. And so, oh my goodness gracious, I've been doing that all morning. I don't know why. So anyway, the challenge of Christ was, we're not even supposed to believe in him if he did not fulfill his own predictions. One of the major predictions that he made was Matthew 16, 27 and 28. The Son of Man will come in the glory of the Father with his angels and shall reward every man according to his works. And verily I say unto you, there are some standing here which shall not taste of death until they see the Son of Man coming. Ladies and gentlemen, there's no way around it. It is absolutely irrefutable. Jesus said he was coming back in judgment in the first century, in the lifetime of the people that were standing around him. Now, unless we've still got some 2,000 plus year-old people running around, then guess what? That means the Lord came in that generation. Well, of course, that's a daunting challenge for anyone raised in the traditional view. I was. I had no clue about the challenge of Christ. But when I began to realize how pervasive the language is about from both Jesus and his apostles in the predictions of the first century coming of the Lord, I was blown away. And when I discovered the apocalyptic language, the metaphoric, non-literal nature of the language of the coming of the Lord on the clouds with flaming fire, with a shout, to gather the elect, etc., 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 the pieces started falling into place, ladies and gentlemen. It has been and continues to be an incredible, marvelous journey to see, to be able to defend Jesus and his challenge. I no longer have to fear atheists, agnostics, Jews, Muslims, all of whom argue, hey, look, Jesus said he was coming back. In that generation, he didn't do it. The world's still here. Therefore, your Jesus is a failure. Because you see, he never promised to come back as they envisioned it. He never promised to come back like I thought he did as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body. No, that was not his promise. So I've been developing for you the idea of the invisible parousia. I have been focused on 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We went last week into chapter 4. Now, last week, near the end of the video, I raised the issue of Abraham and resurrection. And I said I wasn't going to do it. And the more I thought about it, I thought, no, I'm just going to have to do this because this is so absolutely incredible. And it is, ladies and gentlemen, it is definitive. In my estimation, it is irrefutable in proving that the resurrection, point number one, was not to involve biological bodies decomposed and in the ground. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. Secondly, it has nothing whatsoever to do with some proposed end of time into the Christian age. Look, just over the last couple of days, I've had people on Facebook and YouTube both accost me and saying, look, Preston, you just don't get it. The resurrection is at the end of the Christian age, the end of the current age. And when I pointed out to them, no, I do get it. I get the fact, as I've said on this channel many times, the Christian age, the age of the new covenant, has no end. You know, folks, I know I've said that a lot. If you don't get anything else out of today's video, please catch the power of that station or statement. The Christian age has no end. If the Christian age, i.e. the current age, has no end, then we're not in the last days, and we're not looking for the last day. We're not looking for the end of the Christian age. Seriously, do you catch the power of that? Please ponder it, think about it, study it. Okay, so last week I mentioned Abraham and the idea of the unseen resurrection. And I might have left you hanging. So like I said, I said last week I was not going to address it, changed my mind. Because like I said, this is absolutely critical. To understand what we're going to do, I want to go back to Isaiah chapter 25, verses 1 through 8. In Isaiah chapter 25, and by the way, Isaiah 24 through 27, I expanded, I think, properly so, all the way through chapter 28, even into chapter 29, but nonetheless, 24 to 27 are generally called the little apocalypse by biblical scholars, and with good reason. The reason it is called that is because the New Testament writers quote, they cite, they allude to, they echo the language of Isaiah 24 through 27, in their predictions of the end of the age, in their predictions of the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection. So unless we're willing to argue, as Richard Carrier, an atheist that I debated last year, argued, well, you see, he said, those Old Testament prophecies were dealing strictly with their day and their time, and they never extend beyond that. The New Testament writers, although they quoted those verses, were completely misusing them, completely abusing the context. Then the New Testament writers lied when they said that their eschatological hope was nothing but the hope of Israel found in the Old Testament, found in the Tanakh, and they quoted from those Old Testament prophecies. It was shocking. I mean, I knew it was going to happen, but it was shocking to hear Richard Carrier say that the New Testament writers were abusing the context of those Old Testament passages, and the New Testament citations of those Old Testament prophecies had nothing to do with those Old Testament prophecies. That's amazing arrogance as far as I'm concerned. But nonetheless, here's Isaiah chapter 25, verses 1 to 8, in a nutshell, paraphrased. In verses 1 to 3, Israel and the prophet rejoice, although they lament at the same time. Yes, there's sadness and there's joy. They rejoice, or I should say they lament, that Jerusalem and the temple was going to be turned over to foreigners. The city was going to be desolated. By the way, Jerusalem was not destroyed under Antiochus Epiphanes. So this passage has nothing to do with Antiochus Epiphanes. The city was destroyed in 586 BC, and so some scholars say, well, that's what we're talking about here in Isaiah chapter 25. That won't work. Let me continue. So in verses 1 to 3, we have this prediction of the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. In verse 6, in that day, the Lord shall prepare a great feast, a feast of wine on the lees, a feast of fat things, a feast of marrow. This is what's known as the Messianic banquet. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, you may be familiar with the term of the Messianic wedding banquet. A couple of years ago, I was giving a presentation to a group of Baptist ministers, and I kept referring to the Messianic banquet. And finally, the host of that gathering said, Don, you're dealing with a bunch of Baptists here. And he said, we are used to the term Messianic wedding banquet. So he said, you might want to clarify that that's what you're talking about. And I was like, well, of course. They're the same thing. Messianic wedding banquet is the Messianic resurrection banquet. There is no delineation and dichotomy between those. And literally, the guys in the group start going, okay, now we know what you're talking about. You got to know your audience. So, verse 6 is the prediction of the Messianic wedding banquet, which in turn is the Messianic resurrection banquet. Now, notice, in that day, what day? The day of the Messianic resurrection / wedding banquet. In that day, the Lord shall swallow up death. He shall remove the veil that is cast over all of the nations, and he shall swallow up death forever, and there will be no more tears. So what do we have? Messianic resurrection wedding banquet at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. You know, folks, I've said for many years, and this is critical, that it is so important to realize that in biblical prophecy, salvation and judgment are so intertwined that they cannot be separated. You cannot say, like Thomas Ice did in sending me a private email on one occasion, and he said, the problem with preterism is this: all you guys see is judgment and condemnation. He said, okay, that took place in AD 70, but then you have the salvation of Israel that takes place at the end of the current Christian age. And he said, this is a massive, fatal problem with preterism. And my response to that was, and by the way, last November, December, I introduced a book that develops this extensively, ladies and gentlemen. And that book is, These Are the Days in Which All Things Must Be Fulfilled. In that book, please listen to me carefully. In that book, I document passage after passage after passage after passage. I don't even remember how many passages. But these are passages which conflate the time of judgment, and the time of the Great Tribulation, with the time of the resurrection, the time of the kingdom, the time of salvation, the time of the Messianic banquet, Messianic wedding banquet. Do you see the implications of this? If it's true, and it is unequivocally true, if it is true that the Bible links the end of the age, judgment and destruction of Old Covenant Jerusalem and the temple with the Great Tribulation, the judgment, but salvation, the kingdom, the resurrection, the coming of the Lord. If in fact, and it's really not if, as I prove in that book, if in fact those things are conflated, joined, inextricably bound up together, then it proves once and for all that the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection occurred in AD 70 in the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem. Okay, so let me drive a point home here. In that day, the day of the Messianic wedding banquet, the Messianic banquet, in that day of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the resurrection would take place. That's Isaiah 25, 1 through 8. In that day, verse 9, we shall say, this is our God, and we shall wait on him, and he will save us. Who's speaking? Old Covenant Israel. So in the day of resurrection, the day of the Messianic banquet is the time of the judgment and destruction of Old Covenant Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple. Do you see the good news, bad news? Do you see that there's some marvelous, marvelous news being predicted here? But there's a dark lining to that cloud. Or you could turn that around. There's a silver lining, there's a marvelous silver cloud. I'll get this right in a minute. There is a dark cloud with a silver lining. The dark cloud is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The silver lining is, hey, that's the time of the Messianic banquet. Hey, that's the time of the destruction of death. Hey, that's the time of salvation. We cannot separate these constituent elements from one another. So, do not fail to see the following. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 55 and 56, Paul, in predicting the resurrection, that 99% of Christianity says, oh, that's at the end of the Christian age. Oh, that's the raising of decomposed bodies out of the dust. But Paul says, when the mortal puts on immortality, when the corruptible puts on incorruptibility, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. He's quoting directly, and by the way, all scholars agree with this. He is quoting directly from Isaiah 25, verse 8. So for Paul, the resurrection of, quote, the body, and the question is often raised, is he talking about individual biological bodies that have died, decomposed, and gone into the dirt? That's the common view. But notice, Isaiah's prediction of that event is a corporate reality. In that day it shall be said, this is our God, he will save us. That's a corporate reference. Now, don't misunderstand me. It is absolutely true that individuals they make up the corporate, right? America is a corporate, collective body, but it's made up of individuals. But you see, we have to realize in ancient Israelite thought, and look, any number of scholars document this. I'm not going to go into great detail. If you want documentation from it, scholars from N.T. Wright to Sullivan to W.D. Davies and R.T. France and on and on and on it goes. These scholars all admit when the Bible talks about resurrection, the initial predictions had to do with a corporate resurrection, a collective resurrection, and that the original prophecies were not they were not focused on the raising of individual bodies that were decomposed and had gone to dust. John Levinson is a really, really good scholar who discusses this at great length. I recommend you get that book. It ain't cheap, but it's well worth the price. Okay, so here is Paul talking about the resurrection of the body, quoting from Isaiah 25, verse 8. But the body in Isaiah 25 is the corporate body of Israel. That is the focus. Now you can break that down and say it's the righteous remnant of Old Covenant Israel, which is more technically accurate, but it's nonetheless the corporate body of the saved, of the righteous remnant. Now then, oh man, I'm almost out of time. Here's what I want you to see. Let me recapitulate one more time to get the constituent elements in front of us. Isaiah 25, 1-3, destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Isaiah 25, 6, messianic wedding resurrection banquet. Isaiah 25, verse 8, resurrection. Isaiah 25, 8, in that day. In what day? The day of the messianic resurrection banquet. In that day, what day? The day of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Now, let me take the remaining time to give you an ultra quick, I'll expand on this next week, but an ultra condensed version of Isaiah 65, because it's the same identical prediction with slightly different terminology and additional constituent elements. In Isaiah chapter 65, Israel would fill up the measure of her father's guilt, Isaiah 65, verse 6. But a remnant would be saved, Isaiah 65, verse 8. As one says of the new wine that is in the cluster, do not destroy it all. Even so, I will not destroy them all, for a remnant shall be saved. But in spite of the salvation of the remnant, the Lord says, you will all bow down to the slaughter. Now that's everyone except the righteous remnant. For the Lord God shall slay you. That's Old Covenant Israel. This is a prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the people, the unrighteous corporate body. And he says, my servants will eat, you shall be hungry. My servant shall drink, you shall be thirsty. My servant shall sing for joy of heart. You shall wail for sorrow of heart. For the Lord God will slay you and create a new people with a new name. Now, folks, if you don't see the parallels between Isaiah 25, 1 to 9, and Isaiah chapter 65, you're probably not paying attention. Both of them have to do with the ultimate end-time fate of Israel. Both of them have to do with the judgment and condemnation of Israel. Both of them have to do with the salvation of the remnant. Both of them have to do with the messianic banquet at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. And that would then result in a new creation. This is the salvation of Israel. Folks, I'm completely out of time. Be sure to join me next week.